Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Simon Mills. I'm a Senior Associate at the Zien Group, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's FS Club webinar, where we're going to be discussing the dilemma of ESG and supply chains in the construction industry. Now, I'm joined by James Swanston, who's the CEO and founder of Voyage Control, a technology business focused on making logistics more efficient. As always, the agenda for this webinar is very simple. Following my introduction, our speaker is going to make their presentation, and then we're going to move on to the Q&A session. Now, I'm afraid that you are all muted, but you are able to submit your questions through the chat tool, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. Please do chip in at any point of the proceedings. I'm going to be collating your questions, and I'll put them to James at the end. Now, as with all of our FS Club webinars, we're going to be recording this session so you can come back and access the slides and the presentation at a later date. Now, before we move on, I really must thank our FS Club members who've opened up our webinar series to the public. With their help since March of 2020, we've held over 400 of these events on topics as diverse as money laundering, the metaverse, and high salinity agriculture. The FS Club is the premier global executive knowledge network for technology and finance, where members and their guests can meet over a glass of wine to debate key issues which impact on financial services, technology and society. It's very much like a 21st century version of the city's 17th century coffee houses. And so, without further ado, I would like to introduce today's speaker. James, tell us about ESG and supply chains in the construction industry.
Great, thanks Simon, and hello everyone. So what I'd like to do is sort of do a bit of, I guess, a brief walk through the world of the construction industry and how that impacts on sort of supply chains and everything like that. So I'm just going to jump into this. Perfect. And just to give you a bit of background, I've been based in the UK for about 15 years. London's my favourite city. It's been fascinating to see London's skyline change, and indeed the skylines of many global cities change. And I'm very tremendously fortunate to be able to sort of be involved in a lot of that in a lot of the world's largest cities. In many respects, the discussion today is around ESG and supply chains, but fundamentally, there's a very large operational challenge for a lot of our customers, and just a real lack of visibility with supply chains. And every time we sort of spend time with construction companies, it's actually quite fascinating to sort of understand that. As much as there might be strategies in place to talk about what companies want to do from, dare I say, an aspirational perspective, often there are some very, very significant tactical and operational challenges that our clients face. Fortunately or unfortunately, the construction industry, like I guess every other industry, was significantly impacted by COVID. And in many respects, that forced quite a seismic change in the way that the industry operates, and sort of has very much required construction, as with many other industries, to think about what they're doing. And ultimately, I think really, what I've got on here could really apply to any industry. Ultimately, any large business requires a supply chain that's visible, where people know what's going on, both at a tactical and a strategic level, where there's an understanding of being efficient and resilient. I come from a military background, and within the military, supply chains are utterly crucial, and battles and wars are won or lost because of supply chain issues. And there's always famous discussions about Napoleonic's withdrawal from Russia back in the early 19th century, which very much was a horrendous logistical failure. So ultimately, I come from that background, and so when I got into this industry, it was very clear that there were a lot of challenges, and so those items, visibility, efficiency, resilience, apply very much in the military, and actually they really apply in every other sector. But on top of that, there's a need to sort of overlay requirements around sustainability and wider ESG obligations, and then general compliance with the law. And certainly in the UK, there's a lot of regulation around that as well. Whether it's enforced is another topic. But then critically for any sort of business, understanding the needs of customers is quite critical as well. Just to give you a bit of a sense of sort of our scale and what we do. Our platform initially launched in 2013 in the events industry, supporting Olympia London, the big venue in West London that many of you will be familiar with. We now operate in 15 countries, supporting about 100 construction firms, owners, asset operators, and the projects that we support from a construction perspective at the bottom end sit at around the sort of £5–10 million mark. And at the top end, one of our projects in the Middle East is almost a £50 billion project. So we sort of see this wide variety of issues globally, and how different markets and different customers are trying to adapt to a new sort of technological reality and a sort of macro reality around ESG and so on. Just to give you a bit of a quick sense of what we do. So the core focus of what we've been helping customers with is sort of scheduling and managing last mile deliveries into construction projects. I actually, just before the call, I was just chatting with Simon and Peter about how actually the name of our business initially was Carbon Voyage, because sustainability is very much the heart of what we do, and we actually changed it to Voyage Control. And the reason we did that was because ultimately to achieve the outcomes we needed to achieve, we had to sort of look at this from an operational perspective rather than an ESG perspective. And certainly I think if there's one thing that you take from this, it's that ESG strategies and tactics in a construction business have to be very intimately linked to operational outcomes and potentially cost outcomes. But so fundamentally, this is what the platform does. It's about scheduling and optimizing the movement of materials onto job sites, managing tower cranes and hoists, understanding the material that's moving through job sites, and then critically having the data to understand how your supply chains are operating, and being able to do things like capturing Scope 3 emissions and so on. And so that's really where we started, and this is very much a journey with our customers. And then we sort of transitioned into helping customers track materials through the supply chain. Our very first client doing this was Madison Square Garden Sphere in Las Vegas. I'm sure some people will be aware that there's an MSG project scheduled for Stratford, but certainly our focus has been helping them to sort of really understand the logistics challenges through their supply chain. What's particularly interesting with a client like that is because most of our customers are construction companies, they don't necessarily bear the financial risk of what's happening on a project. Whereas when some of our customers are actually the owners and developers, they have a very different perspective on wanting to understand movement of materials through their supply chain. So the industry itself fundamentally has a lot of challenges, and I was at a conference in Washington DC a couple of weeks ago and talking about how it's sort of a death by 1,000 cuts in the construction industry. These are sort of some enduring challenges that we see in the sector, and this isn't just in the UK. This is global. Massive project delays, massive increases in material and labour costs. You then have challenges like the demand for skilled engineers in Saudi Arabia and the wider Middle East puts pressure on firms here in the UK and Australia, and there's sort of that war for talent. And similarly, material prices are significantly higher than what they used to be, and this particularly has affected contracts that were fixed price contracts for construction projects, and just piling pressure on construction companies. Shipping costs in 2021 and early 2022 peaked significantly. Again, just putting massive pressures on supply chain, but then also a lot of uncertainty about the movement of materials through the supply chain. And on top of that, you then have this sort of macro sort of tidal wave where the whole sort of built environment has to radically think about what's in their supply chain, who is in their supply chain, how are construction companies addressing their net zero, modern slavery, wider ESG needs, and there's a number of key drivers for that. I guess a lot of the things I'll talk about are sort of US focused, where the vast majority of our customers are, but what I say sort of very much holds true, sort of here in the UK and actually globally as well. We did a survey in Q3 last year with the Construction Industry Roundtable that I'm a part of, and that sort of represents, it's an industry body with about 150 members, all of whom are CEOs or CXOs of large construction companies. And it was good to sort of just get this sense of that sort of executive view of what the challenges were over the last couple of years in terms of those increasing costs and project delays and interruptions and so on. What was sort of fascinating though was, and this sort of didn't really surprise me, but it was good to get some empirical evidence, was just sort of getting a sense of how little a lot of construction companies know about this, and really understand what's going on in their supply chains. As I mentioned, I was in the military, and at every sort of command level in the military, there are key sort of logistics roles and functions. Whether you're in a platoon or troop, or a company or squadron, a battalion or regiment, through to the head of the armed services, logistics is critical. And so what's quite fascinating is many of our customers are multi-billion-dollar revenue businesses, and yet very few of them think about supply chains in a strategic sense, and that creates a huge number of challenges for them. I think sort of bringing into play a bit of a UK example, and these slides come from the Construction Products Association, and it's always quite interesting to see what their chief economist puts out, and this sort of just again talks about some of these strategic pressures facing the construction industry, whether it's around material price inflation or insolvencies, and there's a very intimate link between the two. As I'll sort of talk about in a little bit, price of materials has a very large impact on sustainability, because ultimately this is an industry where, because of it's so inefficient, the sort of the profit margins, particularly for construction companies, are very low, and so any sort of ability to shave off cost through cheaper materials is a key theme that we see globally, and then that clearly has an impact on the sort of sustainability requirements of a project, and so on. So just, I guess, keeping on with that military theme, it's always important, I guess, as an ex-army officer to mention Sun Tzu or Clausewitz or something like that, and I think this is one of my favourite quotes from him, and this very much goes to the heart of this issue in the construction industry, where the industry is very much driven by whiteboards and spreadsheets and frantic phone calls to find out what's going on, which actually sort of goes to this sort of overlying issue of disorder in the construction industry. Yeah, the construction industry and the supply chains of the construction industry are very complex. The industry itself operates in a way that there'll be materials moving all over the place to support projects. You might have steel that's coming from Brazil, then being fabricated in Germany, then ending up in the United States to be put on a construction site. But it's really no different for fish that's caught in the North Sea that's then sent to China for processing, then sent back to Europe for sales and everything like that. So construction is very much the same. I often talk about the construction industry as being a very bad franchise model where, whilst the brand name may be the same on any construction site, often the ways that they operate are very much done at a project level, so more sort of emulating a corner shop. And so you might have a number of materials that are coming from overseas, not necessarily the vast majority of what's happening on a construction site, but certainly quite a bit. And just sort of tracking and understanding that is difficult. If you think about some of the challenges that exist globally, concerns about modern slavery in Western China or sanctions related to Russian businesses, just sort of not necessarily knowing and having that visibility through the supply chain presents a huge amount of regulatory risk to the construction industry. There's a fairly insane story about a global cement company that a couple of years ago was actually paying bribes to ISIS. And I know that sounds utterly ridiculous, but they were fined about a year ago in the US and had to pay $80 million because they were literally bribing or paying protection money rather to ISIS in Syria. So these are very tangled webs. And so you have these challenges that exist, and having these international supply chains causes these operational challenges to projects. But in trying to unpick those operational challenges, there's the ability to think about ESG as well and helping customers get that. And ultimately, it comes back to this visibility issue. And that's just on a project level. When you sort of then transition from that into sort of an enterprise level, the reality is that there's the fragmentation really causes issues for clients when they're thinking about how do they strategically manage their supply chains. And that fourth point around compliance risk becomes far more important. In a tactical construction project level environment, people may not necessarily care about their modern slavery obligations, but certainly once you get to the sort of headquarters of any major construction company, that very much is a very different talking point. So construction projects and construction companies have immense supply chains. I just sort of quickly looked at one of our clients who we're supporting. We're on about 40 of their construction projects at the moment. And just from a logistics perspective, over the last 6 months, there's 700 sort of subcontractors who've gone into those 40 sites. If we sort of go back a couple of years, you end up seeing thousands and thousands of sort of tier 1, tier 2 suppliers moving into those sites. And that's really just from a logistics and material perspective. That doesn't speak to the vast majority of people who are on job sites who are labourers. The sort of image on here it comes from a UK business called Neutral that looks at labour and supply chains on construction sites, and this is quite an interesting one, talking about what's going on from an ESG perspective, and they've been looking at this from a modern slavery perspective, but in the UK in particular, when you have things like the 106 planning requirements for projects, often there are implicit requirements to look at local hiring, which goes to the S in the ESG, and trying to help construction companies work out how to map that is very difficult. A lot of well-known construction companies are still using paper forms and spreadsheets to do that, and so there's still a bit of a challenge around sort of using technology to manage that. I mentioned earlier the sort of impact of inflation in the construction industry, and fundamentally there is this interesting sort of interplay between cost and climate. Unfortunately, the industry is one where profitability is a challenge, and so it sort of brings into play this sort of lowest bidder mentality with everything. And it's not necessarily about who's going to provide the right service or the longer term value. It's often about who's the lowest cost now, as opposed to say what that total future cost is going to be. And certainly when you think about where there's requirements to look at building fabrics and change things in time because they're causing issues. And certainly up in Scotland, there's a lot of regulation around this. Sometimes there's that very much short-term thinking, which ultimately results in a higher total cost in the end. And then there is this interesting contractual dilemma in the construction industry as to who pays when things go wrong. Is it the construction company? Is it a subcontractor? Is it the owner? And often, there's you just sort of see people deflecting risk onto others. And so I think that sort of brings us to this whole challenge around the sort of impact on the industry and what are the sort of competing pressures for construction companies when they're thinking about ESG and what does that mean. I think we're still in a point of time where there is quite a lot of greenwashing in the industry and a lot of, dare I say, innovation washing, but that's going to have to radically change in a number of years. So I thought I'd just talk through a few of these sort of key drivers as we sort of see them. For us, I think the biggest driver globally is going to be clients. As much as government regulation is important, ultimately government isn't necessarily a customer. Certainly when it comes to infrastructure projects here in the UK, for example, it is. But typically the vast majority of construction work is commercial. And so a lot of construction companies have to align their ESG strategies and operations with what their customers are doing. The sort of number of construction sort of projects for data centers around the world and for pharma companies is just crazy. And so I thought it'd just be interesting to sort of mention a couple of these here. And we do work indirectly for pretty much all of these. And so ultimately there are going to be some very specific times from a customer perspective where this is needed. That being said, where you sort of see this interplay then of within, say, a very large customer who is saying we need to have these particular obligations in place, and they're very clearly defined at a strategic level, but not necessarily implemented at a tactical level. And then when that is passed into a construction company, you then sort of have that precisely sort of mirrored issue where strategically these things are talked about, but not necessarily implemented at a tactical level. But this will change in the next few years such that these things will just become critical. And they'll sort of go through this process of being, customers, differentiating themselves in the market because they are going to meet these objectives through to a point probably in about 10 to 15 years where these things will just be required. The UK has had a long history of regulation around this, and in 2013 we started doing environmental reporting as a result of the FTSE for Good index, and that has continued from there. And certainly over time this increases. And what's happening from a public markets perspective through to local government regulation or sort of TfL regulation is all very clearly moving in a particular direction, which is really going to force this. Within the US, and I definitely would not have said this had I provided this sort of speech a year ago, I think the US is going to be very quickly sort of catching up to where, say, Europe is. And there's a number of different drivers. Firstly, from a publicly traded company perspective, there's a proposed rule which is likely going to take effect this year or next, which will sort of really start to force an issue for any publicly traded company understanding their supply chains. And one which is particularly interesting for us is the impact on construction companies that are doing federal work. And this will also sort of, and even if it's not a federal project, the companies themselves are going to have to present a lot of data on what their supply chains are doing. And that creates a great opportunity for us as a business in that a lot of construction companies just aren't ready for this. The other sort of interesting component of this, though, is the employees. This article has nothing to do with sustainability. It's all about technology, but it's actually the same core issue. In the US, there are 500,000 job openings in construction, so attracting talent is a key issue, and that's the same globally. And one of the key, and this article talks about how if construction isn't using tech properly, people. One of my customers said to me a year ago, I didn't go to university for 5 years and study engineering to drive a spreadsheet, and that's certainly the case. But the same can be said from an ESG perspective, where I think that the younger generation is far more attuned to ESG and being good citizens. And certainly I think a point will come where construction companies will lose talent wars because of this. So what does that all mean, I guess, from this whole dilemma of ESG and supply chains? So I figured I'd sort of start again with this slide. The biggest issue that I see and which needs to be resolved is just sort of the centralized management of supply chains. It's very difficult for anyone, whether it's an owner, a subcontractor, or indeed anyone in a construction company to do this properly if there's no central organisation in a business, and that would be a very seismic change in construction. And if I go back to sort of a military analogy, you can't have a scenario where platoons are doing their own thing with their own logistics, and they aren't feeding into a wider logistics strategy. And the same is exactly the same for the construction industry. Lord Kelvin spoke a lot about how important it is to measure things, and in the absence of being able to measure things, you can't manage them. And certainly that sort of visibility of helping construction companies understand what's going on and doing that in real time is very important. And as I sort of said earlier, this isn't just about operations or just about ESG. It's actually key to sort of look at both together, because if you can have visibility from an operational perspective, a great byproduct of that is having visibility from an ESG perspective. Efficiency in supply chains. I think the construction industry can learn a lot from other sectors with this. It's no sort of accident that a number of large construction firms globally are bringing in talent from other industries. One of our customers in the US, their head of sustainability used to be the head of sustainability at Pepsi. We see people from Airbus going into some more forward-thinking construction firms. And so there's an opportunity for sort of cross-industry knowledge sharing. Nothing that we're doing in my business is particularly revolutionary or groundbreaking. We're really just applying our thinking to what's going on in other sectors and bring that into construction. Resilience, I think, was a major shock to a lot of construction companies globally, and sort of transitioning from thinking about solely just in time to nearshoring products and everything like that. The picture on the right is we do quite a lot of work at the Port of Los Angeles, and there was literally 100 container ships just queuing outside that at a period of time at the end of 2021. So just sort of understanding that resilience, whether it's from a sourcing perspective or as companies start thinking about using technology, a cyber perspective, and then sort of understanding sort of some of those insurance risks and so on. Sustainability and compliance. I think what one criticism I would perhaps level here in the UK is it's interesting having been involved with a number of local authorities with looking at new developments and sort of talking about how we were going to meet obligations around vehicle numbers or reporting, how often or local authorities don't necessarily have the staff or bandwidth to actually go and enforce a lot of the rules. But ultimately, these are things that will need to happen. And it will be very telling when a construction company gets in as much trouble for missing an environmental responsibility as much as they do for missing health and safety responsibilities. Ultimately, though, I think it is going to come down to, very much from a selfish perspective, construction companies thinking about what the customers' needs are. The two pictures here, one on the left is Amazon talking about their supply chain sort of sustainability strategy. The number of construction companies doing work for Amazon is huge. The picture on the right of that Amazon report is actually a construction project that we're working on in Washington, DC. And then Brookfield, one of the largest asset managers globally, the likes of Brookfield and sort of Macquarie from Australia, they have some very, very clear strategies around sustainability, and that's going to have a massive impact in the business. But then I guess for me as a sort of construction technology company, we need to sort of understand that this is a very big sort of behaviour change issue, and sort of trying to go suddenly to a situation where we're using buzzword bingo and having an AI tool and blockchain. Sounds great, and it might be good to raise some funding from venture capital funds, but it's not going to really help the industry move forward. And so we need to sort of take this longer term view of, helping our customers over a 5 or 10 year period to sort of get to a point where they're truly managing their logistics and sort of really understanding that sort of dilemma of how to manage ESG alongside supply chains. That's all I thought I would go through. So Simon, I'll hand back to you.
Fantastic. Sorry, just put my microphone back on. That was absolutely fascinating, and I can see we've got a lot of questions from our audience. But as chairman, the privilege of the first one falls to me. I was going to ask you something very dull about air pollution and road transport, but something you said towards the end caught my attention. You mentioned blockchain and kind of pushed it to one side. I believe that companies like IBM have been doing a lot of work on food logistics using blockchain to ensure supply chain integrity. Do you think there are applications for blockchain within the construction logistics space?
Yeah, so there definitely is. I mean, Maersk wound back their blockchain initiatives in the last sort of 6 months or so. I'm certainly, and if I just go back to that slide, I'm certainly not saying there isn't a space for this, but the industry. I mean, you're dealing with people who literally. I mean, there's a multi-billion-dollar construction project in New York, and the person managing logistics literally had a little book, and he was writing in his little book what was going on. That was it. That was how he's managing logistics. So trying to sort of get someone like that to switch to a blockchain solution overnight isn't going to happen. I think one of the interesting sort of changes that we will see in the construction industry over time is that there's just some very significant labour issues, and particularly sort of an ageing population in the construction industry. So I think in about 10 years, you're going to see a lot of people leave the industry who are going to be replaced by people who are under 30, for whom the concept of artificial intelligence and blockchain will be a lot more real to them. They'll all be used to using apps, and in some respects, as a tech sort of CEO, we need to think about ensuring that the tools that we're providing to customers are sort of almost like consumer products rather than business products. So it's definitely going to happen, but the construction industry is just so far behind on some of this. It's just going to take a while to get there, and that's also linked to contracts. In unlike say food, construction projects that are up and running now and will run through to the end of 2030 might have already had all the contracts done for this. So trying to sort of enforce a new solution could be highly problematic. Yeah, we're definitely going to be going down that path, but we're just not there yet. So,
isn't one of the problems that the construction industry is just too complex? It's over complex at the moment. What steps do you think could be taken to try and simplify things a little bit?
Yeah, so I think, and sort of going back to that whole military thing, it's one of my staff. He worked at 5 different construction projects, and they had 5 different sets of operating procedures and 5 different sets of spreadsheets, and that's unbelievably inefficient. So I think a lot of construction companies are their own worst enemy because they don't standardize procedures, and they have a view that every project is so unique that they can't use a single set of standard operating procedures. And I think just doing that, and that doesn't just relate to us, that's just a general comment about construction companies, that will have a massive difference. We still see challenges with our customers where we'll be on 50 sites with a client, and then one project says, I don't really want to use the software, and then because that's too small or whatever, and you sort of see that rather than saying you have to use it because that creates a standard process for everyone, whether it's our team or the supply chain, there's this view that sort of people running construction sites can do their own thing. So I think if that changes, that will help to reduce a lot of the sort of unforced complexity in the industry.
So ironically, we're talking about more professionalism, or a different sort of professionalism.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, people are very experienced, but the reality is that if every single project has their own different ways of doing things because different individuals change, and we also see this with when people are moved between job sites, all the operational procedures suddenly change because a person has left. That's not sustainable by any stretch of the imagination. So it's an interesting dilemma, and that's certainly something that if the construction industry solved through training and I guess more strict rules, it'd be much better.
You've mentioned some fairly frightening existential threats to the construction industry. So, an aging workforce, people leaving, but also you've got this recent very large increase in the costs of construction. Isn't that going to impact on the amount of construction that can take place? So are we going to see less construction going forward? If so, what can be done in the logistics space to help cut those costs and keep the construction industry on an even keel? I mean, that's particularly important for the amount of house building that's going to be done in the UK.
Yeah, we could probably talk about this for several hours, so I'll try and keep my responses pretty brief on this. So, I mean, Australia has just put a pause on all of their major infrastructure projects through to next year, sort of citing cost issues. The unfortunate problem with doing that, though, is those cost issues aren't going to magically go away in 12 months, and if anything, it's just going to make it worse. So, that sort of material cost challenge is going to be there. My personal view is actually the bigger problem is labour shortages, and actually that's going to operate as a much greater constraint on construction projects, more so than material costs. Well, because ultimately, if you don't have enough people who are qualified to do the work, then you literally just can't do the work, and it takes 10 years to train an engineer appropriately. So you have, I think, a big disconnect there, and dare I say, this sort of insistence that everyone goes to university instead of doing apprenticeships, and not valuing apprenticeships maybe as much as they should be is a challenge. Technology obviously has a role to play in reducing that, but that's actually where I see the bigger the bigger problem for the construction industry. Supply chains absolutely can become more efficient, and that, you know, from an operational perspective, ensuring that people only have to order materials once and ordering the right materials can significantly reduce the waste. Yeah, that's a very easy win. But in this environment where you just have so much uncertainty around what's going on, then that creates a bit of a challenge.
Now, a little bit earlier, you mentioned capturing scope 3 emissions in logistics supply chains. What boundary judgments do you use to for the capture of emissions, and how do you use those boundary judgments for identifying other impacts and costs?
Yeah, the accounting of scope 3 emissions is murky to say the least. You know, if someone is driving into central London from Essex and they're delivering to 3 different job sites, how do you determine which job site gets what sort of environmental emission? Do you divide it equally because the truck is effectively going the same distance? Do you divide it by weight? Can you tell exactly what it is? And typically the answer is no, because you have to use the likes of, say, Google Maps or something to do some calculations. So that's a very, very difficult issue to work out. The other area where I think there's a lot of challenges in determining the embedded carbon of a material is, you know, through the fabrication process, you know, what's sort of the waste through the fabrication process. And you know, if you have a ton of steel at the start of the fabrication process and you've got only sort of 700 kilograms after, what's happened to the other 300? You know, is that being reused for something? So the accounting for this is incredibly complex, and you know, we're sort of still grappling with how to do that. And people don't necessarily put the right information in. I mean, we have a funny scenario with a customer where they don't want to necessarily disclose how many generators they've hired for the project because of the potential cost impact on the owner, and so sometimes you see that people don't necessarily want to disclose this information as much as you have that sort of more general accounting challenge. So it's definitely something we haven't solved yet, but we're trying desperately to work out how to do it. I think it's going to be very difficult to provide precise accounting for several years to come still. And again, that's just one of the things we're trying to look at, because, you know, and as we've spoken about previously, it's not just about the embodied carbon, it's you know, particulate matter in London and things like that, which are of concern, and how can you then transition to sort of electric vehicle fleets and stuff like that.
Excellent. Now, thank you very much, James. I'm afraid that time has caught up with us, ladies and gentlemen. I know that some of you still got questions to ask. Please do drop us a line and we can pass your questions directly on to James. We're also going to be posting the recording of this presentation online in the next couple of days, so you can revisit what James has had to say. It just remains for me to thank members of the FS Club for making today possible. I'd also urge you to keep an eye on our forthcoming events page for more webinars, which are going to include parametric insurance in 2023, in, out and shaking about, the launch of the Smart Centres Index 7, which is on the 25th of May, and digital care, who's getting digital now, on the 1st of June. You can catch up with all our previous webinars on our website, on YouTube, or on our Pizzazz TV channel. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much for attending. Goodbye.